Welcome to ReGen Ag Chat. I'm Liz Genever, a farmer and consultant.
I'm Nic Renison, a farmer and educator, apparently, from Cumbria.
We've just used it as a new word. In this podcast, we aim to bring you a diverse range of voices and perspectives that will challenge your thinking and help us all develop resilient agricultural systems. Each episode, we talk with experts, practitioners, and thought leaders who are shaping the future of regenerative agriculture and also generally our mates. Our goal is to provide you with insights and practical advice on how to enhance your farming practice.
So, Liz, what have you been up to lately?
Well, I've been a little obsessed with my meat chickens, but they've gone and been processed. So I'm still slightly obsessed, but less preoccupied with them and fox attack. So that was good.
Did you have good results?
Average weight was 2 kilos. Quite a big variation within them, but most of them have been sold. So hopefully people enjoy them in the next few weeks.
That's good.
I was also involved in an Understanding Ag podcast. So I spoke to Stuart, it was quite like a swapping. So I spoke to Stuart Johnson and Carl Richardsville. So that was quite good. I need to work on the level of ums I do in a conversation, but that's work in progress. And I've also been doing quite a few events and meetings, and the main points of conversation has been sustainable farming incentive, overseeding herbs mainly, and thistles. It's been a bumper year for thistles. How about you?
Well, I had a chat with someone yesterday about thistles. What in your opinion, should you do with a thistle? I'm tempted just to leave them, but if you've got an infestation, I don't know.
I've moved towards this idea that could be an element of controlling them. So that could be topping, it could be spraying them. It depends on the level. However, you've also not just keep doing that. So you've got to recognise what within your farming practice is driving that increase in thistles. And I think what we're finding is lots of bare soil after some dry summers and that wet winter with a wet autumn, winter, spring, summer, and some areas of compaction. So it's just allowed those thistles to go. And then on the farm, have you had visits or?
Yeah, we've had a couple of visits, a few farm visits, and we've had a woofer here. And a woofer, for those who don't know, stands for willful working on organic farms, even though we're not organic. So we've had a girl here from Saskatchewan who was sorted out our veg garden, packed many eggs, and she's been here for a month and she's just left and I'm missing her. We've had a few before that didn't work out that well, but she was off a farm over there, and she was just really good. Got stuck in, so that was a big help.
You've got another one coming soon.
We've got another one coming soon, and I think my experience with woofing is you have to be clear on what you're expecting, and it was just quite good for the kids really to have someone from a faraway place, having dinner with us every so often. She looked after herself a lot of the time, but and it was really good. I enjoyed it.
Excellent.
And I did a talk this week for Natural England, the Natural England North Conference for their people who work at Natural England. That was good. Lots of interest in what we're doing. Lots of interest in the chickens, actually. I think that's it, really.
So terrifyingly, we are edging ever closer to Carbon Calling Conference, 3rd of August. So what have we been busy doing? You've been mainly contacting people for things for the website. I've been contacting people for workshops, but we are excited in between the workload.
Yeah, I think I have fits and starts of excitement and panic. And today I did some Instagramming, 9 weeks to go. I have just sorted out, as I was delivering eggs today, I was thinking I need to get Reno, because he's particularly good in front of the camera, because he's just game for anything if he's in the right mood. And I was delivering eggs thinking, what can I do? And anyway, I've come up with a really good idea. It involves Reno looking like a newsreader. That's all I'm going to say. So watch out for that. Yeah, and we're just on a big ticket selling mission, aren't we, really? And just tidying things up.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is we're being approached by loads of different people. So they've heard about it, but not necessarily been before. So obviously we want to bring everybody who has been back, but we also have an opportunity to bring some new people into the community. So that's good.
And I hope the people we saw at the meetings, the Farming Forward meetings mainly in the Northeast, but also in Forest of Bowland, I hope we see some new faces from those meetings. And yeah, it's just the clock's ticking now. And we've got groundswell to do before that. And it's just a bit of a manic time.
But there's loads of day length, so it's all fine. We can just fill our days.
And our chickens are currently going to bed at 11:15.
Oh, that's nice.
Reno said, I'm not sure I can handle this.
So he needs to buy an automatic door.
I know, it's too tight for that.
So we will move on to the subject of this podcast. So we spoke to Jack Bobo, and he was appointed director of the University of Nottingham Food Systems Institute in July of 2023. He is an esteemed thought leader with a unique background spanning international law, food and environmental policy, behavioural science, and his role is about bringing people together to discuss the challenges and speaking to different audiences. Yes, I did steal that off the website. You found it, didn't you, on Farming Today? That's where you first came across him. Yeah.
Well, and also he spoke, I listened to him speak online at the NFU conference, and he just, well, I found this interview quite testing. I think it's a step for us, for Carbon Calling, to go into kind of hardcore academia and a very kind of a different perspective on the food systems and the whole ag industry. So bits of it I found tricky, but I'm glad we did it. And I hope the listeners find it interesting.
And I do believe I was a bit tired when I did it, so you can probably detect that. I'm a little bit even less tolerant than normal. So,
well, we did talk. There's a little bit of it where we talk about what we're going to have for lunch and what we have for breakfast, and I do apologise for that, but it goes on to a good bit, so I had to keep it in. But yeah, just don't judge us on this.
And I started by asking him how he defined food systems.
Yeah, so the food system is really quite broad. It really encompasses everything that goes into producing the food, processing the food, how we consume food, because everything is related. And if we're trying to improve the food outcomes, we need to think about what all of those trade-offs are. And so the Food Systems Institute is really trying to connect all of the dots across the university so that we can begin to connect the dots across the planet to deliver a sustainable, nutritious, and equitable food future that I think we all want.
So does that mean that you can invite yourself unannounced into various departments across the university?
Absolutely. That one of the things the Institute is doing, it kind of sits across the university. So anything that touches food and agriculture at the university is in scope for us because we're really trying to do two things. Externally, we're trying to enhance thought leadership for the university, engage in global dialogues. And really, I serve as an ambassador for all of that research. So the more I know about what we do, the more I can talk about what we do. But internally, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to connect all of that research so that we can scale the research that we do to have a bigger impact. I think many people, when they think about universities, they think of stovepipes. The people that work in genomics don't talk to the people in psychology, who don't talk to the people in business. And I'm trying to get people out of that. I want to have more conversations, because I think if we do, we can do a better job of the resources we already have. And if we do that, hopefully that means that we'll get more resources to do even more.
And can you give us an example of some of the research that you've got going on currently?
Yeah, so before I got here, in many ways, the Food Systems Institute builds on the Future Food Beacon, which was really focused on alternative proteins that existed for about 5 years. It's become part of our alternative protein center under the Institute itself. But just as an example of what that looks like in practice, so we have researchers that are working on things like cultivated meat and fermentation and mycoproteins and all sorts of things. And often when you're trying to solve a problem, you might think about, well, what's the easiest scientific solution to that problem? And that makes a lot of sense. But what if the easiest science approach doesn't have a regulatory path? Well, you may never be able to bring that product to market. So by making sure that the scientists are engaging with people at the law school and on the policy side and consumer insights, we can ensure that you don't do the science and at the end of the process find out, well, it's going to take another 5 to 7 years to bring a product to market, if you can ever bring it to market. And then you finish that regulatory review and you think, well, nobody wants it. And so, what if we were actually thinking about, well, how do we build not just consumer acceptance, but consumer demand for new products and ideas at the beginning of the process, instead of sort of doing them in series and taking 3 times longer.
So there you talk about alternative proteins, and so the majority of the people that listen to this podcast are probably farmers who think alternative proteins. What's the burger called? What's the burger that everyone?
Impossible Burger. Yeah.
So can you? I don't know if you can do this, but can you pitch alternative proteins to a farmer, as in the pros and cons as you see them? Because I think at the minute they're very defensive when they hear those words.
Sure. Yeah. Skeptical would be a weak statement. So yeah, absolutely. So when I think about it, certainly there's a lot of tension between the livestock sector and the alternative protein sector today. And, there are reasons for that. I think if you're in the livestock space, you feel like you're under attack and that people are saying you shouldn't exist or you're bad for the planet. And, that's not why people are in this. They're in this in order to make people healthier and improve the planet. And so I think people are rightfully turned off by that conversation. So instead, when I think about it, though, I like to approach this from a foresight perspective. I spent a few years working as a food futurist, which is a title you give yourself to get a higher pay as a consultant. But I think about, like, in the year 2050, we need 25% more food, so 25% more protein. And I think, here are 2 scenarios. Scenario 1 is one I call livestock wins. So 100% of that future demand is met because we expand livestock production. Scenario 2, alternative proteins win. We expand production of alternative proteins and livestock production is flat. Now, when I talk to livestock producers and I ask them which future do they want, they almost always say, I want the first one, the one where livestock wins. And I say, well, are you sure? Because in the scenario where livestock wins, we add 20 billion animals to the planet, we cut down 10% of our forests, and people are upset because of the environmental impact of livestock production. But if demand increases and supply increases, their income is flat. So nobody in the UK will make more money in the livestock win scenario, but they will be blamed for all of the deforestation that occurs someplace else. In the alternative proteins win, well, that means demand for real protein has increased, but production is flat. Well, livestock producers have to be making more money in a world in which demand outpaces supply. And so in that world, they're a premium product, and we don't get that deforestation by expanding livestock production. So the world in which the farmers in the UK do best is the one where future protein demand is met by these alternatives. it's not met through expanding deforestation and things like that. And so I think you have to be able to articulate a future in which people are thriving and doing really well and the world is better if you want them to sort of come to the table and talk about, well, what might that look like for me?
Yeah, yeah. Because I first heard you speak at the you were at the NFU conference, I think, and you were probably quite a brave speaker for them to get. But I really like your pragmatic approach, and I think it's something we're trying to do with carbon calling. Is, you know, you've often got extremes in one corner and the other, and it's that conversation in the middle, which is where you can kind of make things change and happen. Yeah. Liz, have you got any thoughts on alternative proteins?
I just think it's also that unintended consequence piece, isn't it? Which is some of that alternative proteins is now deemed to be highly processed. I had a conversation, a friend of mine, partner came and went, well, I went through corn and alternative proteins because it was healthier. And then you can quite happily unpick some of those arguments in terms of from a health perspective, just because of the level of processing in some of them. And I suppose all I'm trying to allude to is it is a complicated piece, isn't it? But it's, I suppose, Jack's point, which is you're just trying to bring a range of people together and have a conversation about it, rather than being your own little in your own little world and going, well, and throwing stones at someone else.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely trade-offs with, ultra processed foods, may not be as healthy in some respects, but we need to produce more protein, and I'm delighted if people eat more beans and lentils. So that would be great, but I'm not convinced that we can meet all of our future protein needs through that. Many people get nervous when we talk about shifting diets, but many of us eat more animal protein than we probably need. We should be eating more fruits and vegetables, and so we could shift our diets. That doesn't mean you should produce less animal protein in the UK. It just may mean that quality protein gets consumed in places that actually desperately need it, and it has an even bigger impact on people's improved nutrition and health.
And well, my obsession with my microbiome continues. So it's also that and then you've got that new level, a lot more awareness coming, isn't it, in terms of the impact of diet on wider, from a microbiome perspective, and then potential future health as well. So it's a complicated piece for people to make some food choices, isn't it? Within that, there's quite a lot of options.
I mean, it's difficult. People won't change what they eat to save their lives. Why do we think they'll change what they eat to save the planet? So yeah, so it's tough, but we do need to change what we eat because, currently our food is killing us. 42% of Americans are obese, 75% are overweight or obese. The UK, numbers, are not quite as bad, but the trends are all in the same direction. And so this is a huge global challenge. 50% of Americans have a diet-related chronic disease. The cost to the U.S. economy is $1 trillion. The cost of diet-related illnesses in the UK is 100 billion pounds. The global cost is 10 to 12 trillion dollars. And so these are some pretty big numbers. So, there really is an intersection, though, of health and nutrition and, how we produce food.
So, Jack, you've worked in a lot of different countries. You travelled a lot, I imagine. Have any countries got an ag food policy that actually works?
Yeah, I'm not sure anybody has one that works, but I think that there are lots of good ideas in different places. I think different countries are trying different ways. So I think that there are lessons that we can learn from different economies. And it's also important to recognize that the food system in the UK doesn't need to look like the one in the United States. It doesn't need to look like the rest of Europe. Every country has the right to figure out what's the right balance. Because for me, it's all about trade-offs. And just to use an example of the European farm to fork strategy, well, that strategy, if fully implemented, would lead to a 15% reduction in food production in Europe. So the benefits of the strategy would be reduced environmental impact in Europe. But if you export your footprint to other parts of the world, there's a real trade-off. I mean, the country that sends the most food to Europe is Brazil. And so you probably don't want to export your environmental footprint to the most biodiverse country on the planet. That might not be a good idea. And so, there's a reason that farmers are protesting, and that's because I think they recognize that if you export that footprint, it's not as if those impacts go away. I mean, producing zero food doesn't mean you have zero food impact. And unfortunately, the current sort of global trading rules, they suggest that that's true. In other words, if you don't produce food, no carbon costs get counted against your country. But eventually that's going to change. And eventually you will get charged for your imports and you will get a subtraction for your exports. And so we don't want to optimize for a system that doesn't value or doesn't cost you when you import, when we know that eventually you will be get charged for that. And I think that gets into some of the conversation here in the UK about tree planting. That I think that what's missing from that conversation is the question of, if you produce, and I just use Wales as an example, if you produce less food in Wales and you import more food, the question for the Welsh government is, does that increase or decrease global emissions? And if they don't know the answer to that question, it may be premature to implement that policy. Because of course the goal is not just to reduce your UK or Welsh emissions, it's to reduce global emissions.
And I suppose also the thing within that, which is if there could be planting trees and maintaining food production. Do you mean it's about how those trees are planted? Is it in a plantation style? Is it in silver pasture type systems? So I know that's moved away from the complexity of, are we changing global emissions? But some of it is about, actually, there's some really successful techniques we can use now to do both, or nearly both, on the same piece of land.
Well, and it doesn't have to be the same piece of land. I mean, there's some land that's not terribly productive and that, maybe would benefit from having more trees planted. And there's some extremely productive land that would be a bit of a shame to take that out of production. And then there's some land where it would make, great sense to have more of a silvopasture approach. And so it's really about figuring out what is that right balance. But if you say everybody has to plant 10% trees, you're almost certain not to get the right balance because there's going to be places where you're planting that you shouldn't, and you're not necessarily going to be planting it in the best, sort of most thoughtful way.
Can we just jump back to the carbon for a minute? And I keep hearing this. I just want to check I've got it right. So if we import soya into this country, the damage that was done, say, in Brazil from that soya, we don't take on any of that, that detriment.
That's right. Under the current system. And so one of the ways that might be taken into account is by something called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, where you do count the carbon of your imports. And Europe is looking to implement this, I think, by the end of the year. But agriculture is excluded from these programs, and except fertilizer. So, think about that. So you're not charging for the imported food, so the foreign producers sort of get a pass, but you are charged for the carbon cost of importing fertilizer, which means a tax on domestic producers. So you're giving a pass to the foreign producers, and you're taxing the domestic ones. So, it's sort of the worst of all worlds, and yet, nobody's really talking about it.
Liz, this is what needs to be in your TED Talk.
I just possibly, but I think, I suppose within this is a side point. I recently went to a cash and carry, which has completely changed my attitude towards food and food systems, because you just suddenly realize how complicated it is, because it's the supply chain. Who controls the supply chain? We can have the greatest will in the world, can't we? But actually, the 99% of people are choosing food out of quite a complex global food chain. And how the hell can we ever try and improve it? Sorry, I'm on a negative, but it's the sudden realization, which is it's hugely complicated. it's really simple to go, I'm going to eat from this person's production. I'm going to eat artisan bread. But how do you start to make that change happen at even county level is just huge.
Yeah, it all comes down to, one, it's complicated, and two, there will be trade-offs.
Okay,
but
I just need to accept it's, yeah, and I think you can, and everybody has to, I suppose the point I'm trying to make behind my negativity is that everybody is trying to encourage people to make slightly different choices. It doesn't mean they have to completely transform their way of living or working, but it's just occasionally making choices. And that could be about recycling. It could be about food. It could be something, isn't it, to try and reduce their impact on the environment.
Yeah. So I mean, I think to maybe shift this to a more positive part of the discussion,
Thank you.
is that, we all tend to use today as the baseline. So, when we talk about land and water and greenhouse gas emissions, we're using today as the baseline. And, just to throw out the numbers real fast, 40% of all the land on Earth is being used for agriculture, the amount of cropland the size of South America, the amount of pasture land the size of Africa. 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture, and about a third of greenhouse gas emissions are either directly or indirectly from agriculture. So those are all big challenges, and those are real. But what we seldom stop to talk about is how far we've come. And to put that into perspective, there are about 3.5 billion hectares of forest on the planet. And if we were farming today with 1960s technology, we would need 1 billion additional hectares of land. In other words, a quarter of all the forest on the planet only exists because of improvements in agriculture. Now, we can't look at a forest and say, agriculture saved that forest, but we can look and say, oh, agriculture replaced that forest. So it's really easy to be negative about the negative consequences of expanding agriculture, but we just don't appreciate what it's delivered. In terms of childhood mortality, we're at the lowest point of all of human history. Yes, 10% of the people on the planet will go to bed hungry, totally unacceptable. But 30 or 40 years ago, it would have been 20% of all the people on the planet. 60 years ago, it would have been 30% of all the people on the planet. So one of the thoughts I would want to leave your audience with is that in many ways, things are not bad and getting worse. They're good and getting better, but not fast enough. What can we do to help the farmer accelerate the pace of innovation? How can we help them to get to their 2070 goals by 2050, their 2050 goals by 2030, because we are moving in the right direction?
It's an acceleration piece. And I suppose and we've got there's an opportunity within that fertilizer, I suppose, linking back to the fertilizer tax that's coming, which is actually, how does that challenge people's production systems, isn't it? So we saw from the high fertilizer prices, people change systems, and some of those have maintained those changes. So people are sort of thinking about how to better use their resources on farm, aren't they? Or capture more sunlight, or make sure there's always a living root. So I think the way that we're thinking about agriculture is also changing in terms of...
And just a concrete example of that, last summer, there was a post note that came out, which is where, sort of Parliament is asking for advice on a topic, and it was talking about the environmental impact of fertilizer use. And I worked with the researcher on that post note and, highlighted that, yes, there can be environmental consequences of fertilizer use, but there's also a reason that farmers are using it. It's to increase yields and reduce hunger and enhance nutrition. And if they only talk about the negatives, one, farmers probably aren't going to read it. But two, it's also just not fair, because they're just important trade-offs. And I was really excited to see when that note came out in January that it was about the future of fertilizer use in the UK. And it highlighted those trade-offs, and it talked about, how do we do things better while maintaining production, as opposed to, just eliminating fertilizer use.
I don't know. Sorry, I'm certainly not arguing for elimination. It's optimization, isn't it? Or how do we make the best of the biological systems to try and harvest the 75,000 tons of nitrogen that sits above every hectare? So we can do. It's how we can work within our current food systems and tweak things, rather than just keep going technology will save us, because technology will save us a bit. We'll contribute, but we also have to look slightly outside some of that.
Well, we need to do things better, and we need to do things differently. And so, it's sort of the job of the farmer to do a little bit better every year than they did the year before. And I think, there's lots of reason to believe that's been largely true. But we will do some things differently as well. I mean, one interesting project here in the UK, Anglo American is opening one of the largest natural fertilizer mines in the world in Northeast England. And, they're going to produce 100 billion pounds of fertilizer over the life of that mine. And so, that creates an interesting opportunity to do things differently here in the UK, but also play an important role in sort of global fertilizer use.
But the do things differently is where you source your phosphate from. Or I think, potash. It's a potash mine, I think. But it's how do we encourage different behaviours? So at the moment, and my bias is I've just finished my Create UK course, so I'm biasing towards a biologically driven systems rather than chemical inputs. But I think it's how, just because it's now really readily available, or we've got a massive amount under the North Sea, doesn't mean that some of the soils that we use don't need it, and that we can run really effective farming systems without high use of nitrogen or fertilizers or wider fertilizers.
I mean, I think inevitably lower input systems are going to become more and more common. And I think regenerative agriculture is how do we do things with a lighter touch and a lighter footprint? I think part of that, though, is that, we also want to make sure that we maintain production here in the UK, because the UK tends to be a fairly productive producer. And if we export that production, it's often going to be produced, with a higher environmental footprint. And so, it's about how do we do things better without dramatically reducing that production.
Jack, I do. The kind of there's a bit of me that thinks that we have come a long way since the 1960s, but we are all fatter. And we spend far longer of our lives sick. We might live longer, but we're sick for longer. And just the state of our rivers. There's a part of me that thinks that we need to act a lot quicker. And by saying we've done a great job and we just need to tweak it a little bit, I struggle with.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly not saying, we've done a great job and so, we can sit back and appreciate it. I'm saying science and technology have played an important role. So now we need to double down in terms of, and doubling down on science and technology doesn't mean more chemical inputs. It means we need to do things better and smarter. Just to use the U.S. as an example, to produce a bushel of corn in the United States, a farmer produces that bushel between 1980 and 2011 with 35% fewer greenhouse gas emissions. They have 40% less energy. They have 50% less water, and they have 60% less erosion. So by every measure, they're not just better, they're wildly better at producing. But that doesn't mean things can't get better. I think that I was with a conservation organization before joining the university, and conservationists love to tell farmers what they should do. And look, I have 2 kids; they're in college. If I want them to do something, I tell them to do the opposite because they're unlikely to listen to me. But what we really need to be doing is talking to farmers about what they could do, because could is about opportunity. Let's talk about how can we reduce your fertilizer use so that you either keep more fertilizer on the farm or you make more money. Because while conservationists think in terms of sustainability is often efficiency, and efficiency is often just good business. And so we're often sort of using the different language to discuss the same thing. I think every farmer would have more sustainable practices if it had a return on the investment, or it was just neutral, but improving their farm. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah. But I suppose that's the area that carbon calling sits in, which is that's what we're heading or aiming for people to do, which is to make more money on what they're doing with a lighter impact on the environment. So, and the trade-off may be yield. Do you mean it is production? And that is difficult, isn't it? As you said, it's always the trade-offs will come in. But I'm having various debates with my cousin of changing some practices in the home farm, and he's saying, oh, well, you'll just reduce yield. It's like, well, we might not. So by going in with that attitude isn't helpful. We can, I suppose I'm interested in exploring ways that we can reduce the inputs while maintaining, if not increasing, yield.
Yeah. Well, and I think sometimes it's the language we use. So I was speaking to a professor at the university a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking to me about moving from intensive agriculture to regenerative agriculture. And my response was, and then he's working to help farmers, do a better job every day. And he said that, sometimes farmers have a negative reaction to what he's promoting, and yet he feels like he's there every day helping them. And I told him, a lot comes down to the language we use, because when you talk about moving from intensive to regenerative, that suggests that what they're doing today is bad and what they need to be doing is good. Why not talk to them about how agriculture in the UK is becoming more regenerative? Well, it's the same thing in theory, but it means something completely different if you're the listener. It's like, if I tell you you're becoming more regenerative, you're like, yeah, that's amazing. If I say you need to stop being intensive, it's like, immediately I become defensive. And so I think the words we use often create more barriers to collaboration than really the underlying ideas, which I think many people are quite open to.
And certainly we know that from the word regenerative, it's a trigger for quite lots of people, and not in a good way. And I think we are very soon to be greenwashed out. It's soon to be greenwashed out of existence in terms of its true meaning, potentially. So, but for me, does come back to profitability. Farmers want it, and being, sorry, so for me, it's about profitability and ensuring farmers are positive, happy, all of those things that are really important to keeping them on the land and keep them doing what they're doing. So I agree with you. Language choice is very important, but sometimes we also need to be a bit more honest, because sometimes it needs to move quicker.
It does. But if it needs to move quicker and farmers aren't sure there's going to be a return on the investment, for them, that's a risk. That if you're a farmer, you have 40 chances in your life to succeed at farming. That's sort of the life of a farmer in terms of their work life. So 40 chances is not a lot. And so if you take a chance on new practices, you need to have a fair sense that it's going to work. And so that's where government has a role, that they can de-risk trying new things. So they can do it by offering incentives. They can have different programs. They can have tax schemes that make it easier, or insurance programs to adopt cover crops or things like that. But then they also need to be sure that they're gathering the data to be able to demonstrate, one, did it have a positive impact on the environment? Two, what was its economic impact? Because if I use a cover crop and it provides an environmental service, but it just costs me money, well, the government needs to pay me if they want me to do that. But if I plant a cover crop and it reduces fertilizer it needs, well, maybe the government doesn't need to pay for that cost, or doesn't need to pay the full cost. Because if my fertilizer costs go down by 10%, well, that's a trade-off. I'm doing more cover crops, I'm paying less on fertilizer, and then the government should pay the difference between those two. And so I think, we need to try new things. We need to incentivize and de-risk the effort. And then we need to be able to gather the data to show what does it actually mean to the bottom line for the farmer. And then that's going to free us up to figure out, who should pay.
In terms of the future, crystal ball, how do you see the next 10, 15 years going with food policy, farming policy in this country and the overall landscape? Just a little question.
Well, so I'll start by putting that question into context. Most of us, when we think about the future, we sort of stop thinking after 2050, when population reaches, maybe 9.5 billion. But one thing is helpful is just to think about what happens after 2050. And one of the things that happens is population growth slows dramatically. And the reason is that we're not having more kids globally. The number of kids born next year will be less than this year and less the year after that, the year after that, and the year after that. So one thing to keep in mind is that 100% of population growth between now and 2050 is because of people living longer. It's a good news story. It's about health and nutrition, but those people will not live forever unless Elon Musk has something to do with it. So one of the things to keep in mind is that every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the world. But every day after 2050, it will get easier to feed the world if we get there without having screwed things up. In other words, if we can get to 2050 without cutting down our forests and without draining our rivers, our lakes, and our aquifers, in many ways, we're good forever. Like all of the productivity gains after 2050 go to reducing the footprint of agriculture. They don't go to massively increasing food production. We just won't need a lot more food. So, so part of it to keep in mind is, we really just have this narrow window. And so, one of the second thoughts I want to leave the audience with is just this recognition that the next 25 years, they're not just the most important 25 years there have ever been in the 10,000 year history of agriculture. And they're the most important 25 years there will ever be. And that's why we need to get it right. And that's why we need to figure out the right balance of technologies and practices to put into place today, because, the next 25 years will determine the fate of the planet.
Oh, flip, no pressure.
We might need the first step. We might just need a little, yeah. It's just, and that I think it is, well, as we've come up several times, at the moment, for me, it feels massive. So it's breaking it down, isn't it? Do you mean? And you've hinted at that incentive piece. So sustainable farming incentive here is helping a lot of farms to explore different ways of farming, and the uptake of that, certainly for certain options, has been very positive. So that is about encouraging people to change practices, and the government are paying some of that or compensating for some of those behaviour changes.
But you think about the scale of government support. It's really quite modest. Right now the UK is spending £100 billion a year to make sick people less sick because of food. What if they spent £100 billion a year ensuring that people had healthy food and healthy diets to avoid those costs? I mean, there's £100 billion on the table that's currently in the healthcare system that could be in our agriculture system. I mean, I think we're thinking small in terms of the types of investments that we could be putting into place.
No, I just think it makes me think of the Henry Dimbleby book, which I think I'm sure it's 13 government departments have some interconnection with agriculture. So if you include sort of health, if you include procurement for food in schools or armies or all of those things, do you mean? So it basically crosses across 13 different, I'm sure it's 13 government divisions or departments. And that, so it isn't, do you mean it shouldn't just be in, we're going to support the farmers, isn't it? It's how it is amplified through all of those different routes, I suppose.
Right. Well, because it's a system, right? And if we want healthy adults, we need healthy children. And if we need healthy children, then we need to figure out, what is it going to take in order to give them a good start in life.
And I just think some of the challenge in again, I'm premising it with my biases that I'm bringing into this conversation, which is some of the challenge we know is that the way we produce food at the moment, wide generalization, isn't generating the healthy diet that we need. So, do you mean the revolution has to happen in all different elements, isn't it? It has to happen within the farming system to get, whether we wish to talk about nutrient density, but we have to, the changes have to be amplified within the supply chain.
But we need to recognize, we could be talking about ultra processed foods and the limitations of that, but processing also reduces food waste. It enhances shelf uh, stability, and so there simply are trade-offs, with each aspect of this. It's easy to say we should all be eating fresh fruit and vegetables, but freezing fruits and vegetables maintains quality, enhances shelf life, and so we don't want to undermine those who can't afford, fresh fruit and vegetables either. And so we don't want to demonize any particular part of the food chain. And we need to recognize that there are many people who struggle to have the money they need to buy the food they want on a daily basis. And so it's not just about making sure that wealthy people have access to good food, but that, all of society does.
But then that leads into the debate, doesn't it? Which is and it's been round and round the sort of government policies, which is about how do you basically subsidize good food going into a range of different communities. And that's been discussed but never really progressed. So they've done various bits about sugar taxes here, and with the idea that the money they're collecting from that end of the supply chain will move into other parts to try and be able to have a wider community of people being able to access different food, but it's never really materialized into significant impacts, I would suggest.
I was in the supermarket. I was in Sainsbury's supermarket first thing this morning.
Other supermarkets are available.
Yes. And Nestle had a breakfast cereal, a Kit Kat breakfast cereal. And I think and Nestle are very good at their regenerative chat, but it's things like that which just shouldn't be allowed. And that's where I think we need to be kind of brave. We need very open conversations about that kind of food, because that's just wrong.
But the wrongness is to do with the amount of sugar? I suppose it's back to the proportion of diet, isn't it? So no food should be demonized. It's to do with the proportion of diet that's being made up by a Nestle Kit Kat breakfast cereal. If it's a once every now and again treat, that's fine. If it's every day, then it is suggesting that. And that I think it is
cereal. It's called a cereal.
It's actually basically eating Kit Kats for breakfast, which we all occasionally do.
Who doesn't want to have Kit Kats for breakfast? But I just think it's completely wrong.
Yeah. Well, so, in 2021, I came out with my book, Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices. And, for me, that question was one of the driving questions, how did we get to a point where 42% of Americans could be obese? And it's also strange because, we've never known more about health and nutrition, and we've never been more obese. We've never had better food labeling, and we've never been more obese. We've never had more healthy food options, despite the unhealthy options. There are more healthy food options in a grocery store today than there would have been 30 years ago. And for me, it's less about the individual foods, and it's more about our food environment. How has the environment in which we find ourselves changed? And so that's part of why in the book I'm really more concerned about the food environment. You won't eat a bad food if it's not presented to you, and so how do we shift our diet to deliver healthier outcomes? Nobody knew anything about health and nutrition in 1960, and they were cooking with lard, and yet nobody was obese. And so I do think that systems approach is just as important, and thinking about how it all works together. Do we need a Kit Kat cereal? No, but do we need to figure out why are we choosing to buy it? That's a bigger question. I think in my book I think there's something like 80 plus varieties of Oreo in the world. The world probably doesn't need 80 varieties, but it's a symptom of a larger problem, and we need to be focused on that. What is that underlying problem that this is a symptom of?
There was an interesting documentary a while ago, which was, I think it was called The Men That Made Us Fat, which was about marketing, doing that. I think, and I can't remember the era it was based in, but that's sort of massive incentive to sort of really market food that isn't always great for us.
Yeah, I mean, some of it goes back to the 1960s, and there was a guy who was working for the movie theater chains, and his job was to try to get you to eat more popcorn. And uh, his name was David Wallerstein. And what he finally hit on is if he offered a larger size, the jumbo size. And so as soon as he did, sort of sales of everything took off. And then he went to work for a small restaurant chain you guys might know called McDonald's. And he was the guy who convinced the owner, Ray Kroc, to offer the large size fry back in 1972. Sort of, in a sense, the rest is history. Um, I mean, for many of us, we don't even know what an adult serving of food looks like. So if you did go to a McDonald's and you had a kid's Happy Meal where you had like a hamburger, a small fry, and a soda, well, the small fry in a kid's meal is a large fry from 1972. And a soda in 1955 would have been 6 ounces. So, I mean, think about that. A small hamburger, a small fry, and a 6 ounce soda was an adult serving of food. Most of us would eat two of those and still might be hungry. And so, that's part of what's changed is, our sense of what is appropriate for us has changed. And that means that, we tend to overconsume, 10 or 20% every single meal because we just don't know what a serving looks like anymore.
We are around lunchtime and I'm now contemplating what I'm going to have for lunch and halve it.
I bet you don't, Liz. I bet you don't.
It's true. I've got some jacket potatoes left over from a village fete, so I'm trying to eat jacket potatoes for every meal at the moment. And side point. It's about, well, I suppose we can Nick and I have had a discussion before about government policy, and I was never I didn't particularly like intervention type routes, and it is about people choices. But that example is that we are rubbish at making choices.
I mean, we're being influenced either way. And, right now, restaurants will give you more food than you need because the cost drivers for a restaurant are labor and real estate. It's not the ingredients. And so if you don't come back, they have no chance of succeeding. So, it's definitely in their interest to give you more food than you need if that's what it takes to bring you back in the door. And so, it's not as if they're sort of trying to make us fat, but the psychology of value is just really, really hard to overcome. I mean, if somebody offers you, 20% more food for 5% more money, I mean, you'd have to be crazy not to say yes, right? And yet you're actually paying to overconsume. It's like a stupid tax of 5%. It's like, and so, but it's really, really hard not to do it. And the psychology of it, even if you cut in half your meal and you just put it aside, well, our brain thinks we didn't finish our meal. So 2 hours later, you're hungry, even though you've had enough calories, because psychologically our brain thinks we didn't finish our meal. And so that's part of why it's almost not enough for us to make good decisions on an individual basis, because our food environment is telling us very, very different things.
Okay. Maybe I won't. Well, it's a 5-bean chili. This is level of detail. Great. So hopefully high protein levels. Be fine. I think I still need some baby steps of what am I going to do next. It feels too big at the moment. So can't halve my jacket potato because I will eat it in half an hour later because that's just what happens. But what are you going to do, Nick, after this conversation? What are you thinking?
I had 3 eggs before we started, a late breakfast. Are you into missing breakfast, Jack, or not?
Yeah, I eat a light breakfast, but I always eat breakfast.
And then I probably won't eat anything until about 4 o'clock. But are you, Jack, are you healthy? Are you healthy and health conscious with the work you do? Or do you like the odd kind of chocolate bar dipped in a cup of tea?
I definitely, have my indulgences, and, my goal is to have us, be able to enjoy our indulgences, right? I mean, think about it. In 1960, nobody was counting calories. They ate anything they wanted. Just the food environment ensured that nobody was fat. And so I don't want us to restrict our happiness. I want us to maximize our joy. And just as an example of that, if you've ever been on an airplane and you got the little 6-ounce soda, you might have thought, wow, that's like the best, can of Coke I've ever had. And the reason is that when you finish it, the last sip is just as good as the first. But when you drink a liter of soda, well, you don't even enjoy it. You've just got all of those calories. So for me, it's about, well, how do we jigger the system so that we're maximizing our joy as opposed to sort of maximizing our quantity?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jack. On that note of a little soda in an aeroplane, which you shouldn't be going on anyway. Well, thank you. Liz, have you got any other questions for Jack? Because I know he's got to scoot.
I think it's, food is always complicated because we have to do it. Do you mean we can choose not to be on an aeroplane, but it's how we make active choices 3 times a day, less if you're fasting. But do you mean, and that's what I think is all, and it's so interconnected with so many different things. You say marketing, how our background, do you mean childhood and all of that stuff? It's so complicated in terms of choices. I suppose as farmer perspectives, we can take control of the bits we can take control of, can't we? Which is, I'm fortunate to eat most of the meat I eat I've produced. Not very good at growing vegetables, but we'll move on from that. So you do have to do what you can do, can't you? But as I think as sort of indicated various times today, I just get overwhelmed when I start thinking bigger than that because it's so complicated.
Yeah, I think though that, we can have some sort of common vision. And I think, that, the UK should not be producing dramatically less food in 2050 than they do today. We should have a goal of dramatically reducing obesity in the country. And, if you're the food industry, I'm not a huge fan of, policy directing them what to do. But if they can't help us to figure out how to reduce that number, then they should expect that there's going to be regulation because, it will bust the economy if we don't address these problems. And by making us healthier, we will actually reduce our environmental footprint as well. And so there's this really, positive feedback that'll come by addressing these problems.
I think the bit that really interests me is how you can, wouldn't it be really interesting if a government, an election is coming, but wouldn't that next government is really prioritizing sort of health and well-being over disease management, which is what is happening at the moment.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
Ooh, political for me. But thank you very much, Jack. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the ReGen Ag podcast. Huge thanks to our sponsor, Tim Nicholson from Cactus Tree Guards, Reno for the music, and Pete Ord, the podcast wizard from the studio at Sunbeams, part of the Annie Mawson Sunbeams Music Trust. See you next time.